Greetings, gentle viewers. I am George from Ireland. Well, this video is a response to President Putin's recent statement. He was saying that liberalism is obsolescent. He was at the G20 meeting in Osaka. So President Putin's comments are unsurprising, yet telling. First of all, what is liberalism? Well, the word's borne a political signification since about 1800. And obviously, like most ideologies, liberalism has evolved in that time. So it started out as an appreciation of the liberal values. Some of these are obviously taken from the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and writings which go back to the 17th century or even to ancient Greece. But believing in the separation of powers, which wasn't original to the founding fathers of the United States, of having a constitution, of not having just an absolute monarch ruling by fiat, believing there's the divine right of kings, believing there ought to be an independent judiciary who would rule in cases without fear, without favour. There ought to be an elected legislature, certainly with an elected element to it, perhaps even a hereditary element to it, but where people could deliberate freely and discuss the issues facing the country frankly, even if those days they weren't democratic, didn't believe in vote for everyone, not all men, and there's no women, and so on. But there ought to be limitations on powers. There ought to be the series of checks and balances. Even the hereditary element was felt to be an element of that to prevent demagoguery and so forth. So obviously modern liberalism is quite different. Now, in some respects, I'm a classical liberal. I'm not a liberal in the modern sense of the word, though I have some sympathy for it. But when Putin attacks liberalism, I suppose he's really attacking even classical liberalism. Though the rich irony is, of course, the Russian constitution is in many ways classically liberal, as in drawn up in about 1994. And it's been really dismantled piecemeal, having passed legislation which makes a mockery of many of the constitutional provisions, many of the safeguards, the rights which are supposedly guaranteed to Russian citizens. So what President Putin has said is this. He's claimed that liberalism, under liberalism, the interests of the overwhelming majority of the population are ignored. Well, I don't think that's true. There are obviously elections, and politicians have to be reasonably popular to be elected and do what most of the people want. They don't always do exactly what the majority want, as the majority are fickle, but they can't completely go against it. But somewhat I take his point that perhaps politicians are more responsive. Take Brexit in the United Kingdom. Brexit must be implemented, because that's what most people voted for. But it really is rich coming from Vladimir Putin, who holds flagrantly fraudulent elections all the time in an atmosphere where there can be no fair elections, quite apart from the ballot stuffing, because the media is muzzled and is censored and is almost entirely on its side and all the rest of it. And genuine protest is stamped on, and dissident journalists are regularly murdered. I could go on and on. But he particularly took aim at the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, and he lambasted her for allowing serious numbers of refugees to come to Germany. Now, Putin is often throwing a hissy fit if he thinks that anyone interferes in internal affairs, and there he was lecturing the Germans about their immigration policy, which of course is yet again flagrantly hypocritical, but I would expect nothing better from him. So anyway, I think that it was rash of Angela Merkel to allow in so many refugees, because they'd come into other European countries, Spain, Italy, particularly Hungary, so not that far from Germany, and that was that. And you should seek asylum in the first safe country. These people have come from Iraq and Syria in particular, so they're safe countries for them. Jordan and Lebanon, they go there, but Jordan and Lebanon almost collapsing under the number of refugees. They go to Turkey, also safe for them, but often they get into the European Union, and there was an element of economic illegal immigration. So I think I have different policies about this. I don't want to get too distracted into this, different attitudes. It should have been made profitable for Greece, which desperately needs money, to keep them, and other EU countries saying, we'll pay you to look after these people, and these people will not be taken by anywhere else. But Angela Merkel did it, and it's caused a bit of a headache, more pressure on public services, obviously more people competing for jobs and so on, and they're overwhelmingly young and male, is sort of creating a generational and a gender imbalance. I know Germany overall needs more young people. Now, the next bit that Putin said is really outrageously offensive and utterly dishonest, and clearly part of his attempt to destabilize Western countries, to set people at the other throats, to cause bifurcation. Listen to this. The liberal idea presupposes that nothing needs to be done, that migrants can kill, plunder, and rape with impunity because their rights as migrants have to be protected. Who on earth ever said that? Who ever said that murder is allowed, or that rape is allowed, or that armed robbery is allowed? Who has said that in relation to these refugees and or migrants? Okay, nobody has said that. He can't cite a single example of that. He's saying that to try and help the neo-Nazis. He calls liberals fascists whilst promoting genuinely fascistic policies at home and abroad. So obviously rape is a crime, robbery is a crime, murder is a crime, and the German police and the police in every country, they are there to tackle that. And the German police do arrest people on suspicion of these things. People are prosecuted, people are imprisoned. And no, obviously they can't guarantee that every offender will be apprehended. So he's really pouring fuel on the flame, on the fire. He's trying to flame these ethnic and religious tensions to cause as much aggro and animus in Germany and other EU countries as he can. It's a grossly offensive thing to say. It's totally irresponsible. He knows what he's doing, and there he is disseminating hatred against ethnic minorities in EU countries and against Muslims in EU countries. So yeah, sure, obviously crime occurs in Germany, and sometimes refugees commit crime. It could be at a higher rate than the general population. But the problem here is the crime, not that someone's a refugee as such. The innocent shouldn't be blamed. Trying to smear all migrants as responsible for this. No, that's not the crime. Is individual, and this is a sort of classic racist and fascist trope, trying to say the whole community, the whole ethnicity is guilty. They're all bad. One of them is bad. They're all bad. It's guilt by association. It's group responsibility. That's obviously vile. So it's a racist trope that he is spreading there, and he's done the same in Russia, trying to blame all Azerbaijanis for a murder supposedly committed by one Azerbaijani. And it would be completely unfair to say that if one Russian person commits a crime, that all Russians are guilty of that. That would be completely illogical and grossly unfair. And then if the Russian government does something which is a vile crime, and the world community calls the Russian state out on this, he'll claim it's anti-Russian, as though it's big as against all Russians, which is nonsense. Nobody should be mistreated for their ethnicity or their citizenship, and that includes Russians, of course. So, but who really gives impunity to crimes? Obviously, Putin does, partly to his army. They're fighting in Chechnya. Now, I know no army is perfect, especially in a counterinsurgency, when they can't tell friend from foe because the enemy don't wear uniforms. But huge numbers of Chechen civilians were deliberately killed by the Russian army. I don't impugn the Russian army as a whole. I don't suggest that most of them are bad. I've known some Russian soldiers and like some of them very much. But I'm afraid to say the conduct of the Russian army as a whole is worse than most. And you can read many reports about this by Amnesty International or any human rights organisation you care to mention. And it's happened on a large scale, and the Russian government knows exactly what's been going on, has done almost nothing about it. They can be almost certain they'll get away scot-free with the foulest crimes, with deliberately killing large numbers of civilians, knowing that they are civilians. And not in the heat of battle. It's not collateral damage. It's not a case of mistaken identity. Knowing what they're doing, taking them out, coolly, calmly, choosing to slaughter civilians. And Putin thinks that's absolutely fine, just as he's doing in Syria, and of course just as his enemies are doing in Syria. ISIS and the al-Nusra Front are at the same game. So again, it is staggeringly hypocritical, but par for the course in his case, to try to spread odium against ethnic minorities, despite the fact that causing disharmonious relations is a crime in Russia. Causing any hatred towards any religious community or any ethnic group is a crime in Russia. You might think that's a good thing, but what that effectively means is a reasoned critique of any faith is not allowed. Upsetting the sensibilities of religious believers is a crime. And when people Pussy Riot held that protest in that church, disrupting a church service, they got, I think it was 3 years in prison. Now, I don't approve of disrupting church services, but surely that was too harsh, that sentence. And there he is spreading racial and religious hatred. And there he denounces multiculturalism, despite Russia being a multicultural country, despite having over 70 indigenous ethnic minorities and having several million guest workers, mostly from former Soviet countries like Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, and Turkmenistan. So he's created a multi-ethnic society and a multicultural society. If he doesn't accept that, he should allow these people in. And he's brought in North Korean labourers as well, just to exploit them, paying them below the minimum wage, so keeping them in wage slavery. So again, yet again, he is disgustingly hypocritical. And there are these autonomous republics and autonomous regions of Russia where ethnic minority languages such as Tatar and Bashkir and so forth have a co-official status with Russian. That is multiculturalism. So he practices multiculturalism. If it's so bad, he shouldn't do it. And Moscow often saw women wearing hijabs, traditionalist Muslim women. And he's got a Shariat state within the Russian Federation. That's Chechnya. He's bosom buddies with Ramazan Kadyrov, the gangster leader of the Chechens, the one who's publicly advocated the honor killing of women and of gays. So there he has, he's tolerating something which is not far off Al-Qaeda in his own country and bankrolling it. So yet again, it is just more bare-faced hypocrisy from him, and failing to stand up for the Enlightenment values that he espouses. And to claim he's got no problem with gay people, which again is a barefaced lie, because as I say, one of his proteges disseminates homophobic hate speech, and indeed considerable numbers of gays are murdered in Chechnya with the connivance of the Chechen regional government. So anyway, liberalism, I mean, I think Russia could do with an awful lot more liberalism, and quite a few Russians do want that. But the more liberal-minded people have left, that Russia's facing a brain drain. The highly educated young people are getting out of the country in many cases. But media that can actually tell the truth, that can tell truth to power, that can publish stories which are embarrassing because the public needs to know. But no, he'd rather his kleptocrat cronies get away with it and keep other people in the dark. He's an obscurantist. So take this Russian journalist Volkov, writing for Medusa, which had to be based in neighbouring Estonia because it would be unsafe. But he came back into Russia rashly and was arrested, and drugs were planted on him. And it was almost unprecedented. The huge protests, which started spontaneously, which were so big the authorities couldn't contain them, that it was a rare victory for freedom, that the authorities were forced to back down and release him. And President Putin even acknowledged that the police had planted narcotics on him in order to fabricate a crime, to charge him with something he didn't commit and send him to prison for years. And he's lucky, Volkov, because he's so famous. And there are many less well-known journalists who've suffered from just the same police strategy. So it's just absolutely standard practice there, I'm sorry to say. Not that there are no drugs, but it's amazing. Like, I remember a 60-something-year-old journalist, a grandfather, who'd never committed a crime in his life, and all of a sudden he starts drug dealing. Does he? Seems like a fit-up to me. I don't actually know that it was a setup for sure, but in Russia you would not expect fair trials. Putin still speaks up for Stalin with his show trials. Stalin, who deliberately murdered millions of Soviet citizens, having many of them shot dead, having made them work to death in slave labour camps, yes, who reintroduced slavery, and I use that word advisedly, slavery, going on to the 1950s, who pursued these blatantly racist policies of deliberately moving whole ethnicities in grossly inhumane conditions, which many people died in cattle trucks, being sent thousands of kilometres from their homeland and often not allowed back for decades afterwards, demonising whole nations like that. And that is the sort of outrageous racism that Putin thinks was wonderful, was the height of civilization, and deliberately causing famines in which millions of people died. I'm not exaggerating, I do mean millions, from the 30s to the 50s, from Kazakhstan to Russia to Ukraine, like that. And that's the sort of inhumanity and outrageous cruelty that Putin thinks that we ought to aspire to. I think you need an awful lot of more liberalism, not less. I know liberalism has its flaws, but my goodness, it's better than the alternative. So you wouldn't be allowed to tell the truth about that, or it's a crime to tell the plain truth about people are starving to death. The government knows, deliberately causing this, removing grain at gunpoint, not allowing people out of the Ukraine, for instance, lying, pretending there is no famine, refusing to accept food aid. Many of these people could be saved, and the government is choosing to let them die of malnutrition. But that was a crime to say that. So look at the dissident journalists who were killed, like Anna Politkovskaya, shot dead in 2006. There was an attempted poisoning of her in a plane when she took some tea a few years earlier, but shot dead in her apartment building in Moscow. Apparently no sexual motive to do with that, or no financial motive. Nothing was stolen from her. Had no personal enemies. The only possible reason to kill her is because she said things that Putin found uncongenial. And the Russian parliament had passed a law shortly before that authorizing the Russian intelligence services to kill any extremist anywhere in the world, in Russia or abroad. What's an extremist? Anything Putin thinks is an extremist. Anything he finds disobliging is extremist. So you can be killed without committing a crime, without being charged with committing a crime, without any suspicion you've committed a crime, for not doing anything, not posing any danger, just saying something or subscribing to an opinion that Putin doesn't like. You could be killed. That must be half the world. How violent and aggressive is that? Take Boris Nemtsov. He was once Deputy Prime Minister of Russia. That was not enough to stop him being shot dead within the shadow of the Kremlin. And I've passed the point where he was shot dead many times. It's about 300 meters from the Kremlin wall. In the heart of Moscow, in this police state with CCTV everywhere, that happened. And people are being convicted for the crime. Chechen men who were serving prison sentences for armed robbery said they were offered release by the Russian secret police, FSB, in return for carrying out this hit, and they did it, and that was that. They told this story. It seems completely plausible. I don't know anyone who disputes that. So to say there's no censorship in Russia is obviously ridiculous. And, it's a flagrant violation of the Russian constitution, which guarantees the right to freedom of expression. And people used to meet regularly on Triumfalnaya Ploshchad to try to exert their right to express their opinions. But they were often arrested by the police. So you have to do these things. You have to get permission from the police. You can't say anything the government might find dislikable. So no censorship. How about the censorship of the Elton John film, that gay love film? If you don't like it, then just don't show the film, rather than show this bastardized version of it. So, you're allowing Elton John's music. Tchaikovsky was gay. Promoting homosexuality is criminalized in Russia. Well, you better stop playing Tchaikovsky, because in a sense that's promoting homosexuality. Like, say, a teacher who on Facebook said that she had a girlfriend and she was dismissed as a teacher because that was supposedly encouraging homosexual behavior amongst minors. That's the way it goes. There's no definition of what this gay propaganda is. Religious propaganda isn't allowed. So Putin, who's supposedly an ardent Christian, he would have sent Jesus to prison for spreading religious propaganda. How do religions get started? Only by evangelizing. So all these supposedly extreme ideas are now mainstream, like gender equality, like racial equality, like a free press, like fair voting. Well, all things that Putin disagrees with. So Putin is very much into policing conformity. He's obviously very close-minded, very rigid, although he will make alliance with anybody, no matter how foul, so long as they share his enemies. He's very categorical in his thinking. He is violently intolerant. He's very judgmental. So he's got this authoritarian conservative mindset. It's all about fear, external threats, but I suppose trying to scare the population, using that as a power structure, creating as many bogeymen as he likes, and trying to spread anti-American prejudice, as though the US wants to attack Russia. I don't think they do. They could have bought it in the 90s when the army wasn't paid for 6 months, but just pay off some of the generals. And that's why they got quite a few people to defect, quite a few chemicals, weapons experts to defect at that point. And who was bailing out Russia in the 90s? It was the World Bank, the IMF, both largely American-controlled, as well as the US, Germany, France, Japan, the UK, Western countries in general were picking up the bill, so there wasn't a total implosion of the Russian economy. So it's about misdirecting people from the kleptocracy, a country which is almost swimming on oil, just floating on the stuff, has the most mind-blowing mineral wealth, which goes to an infinitesimally small fraction of the population, and the ordinary people are exploited, are just fobbed off with this junk food of ultra-nationalist propaganda and militarism, war propaganda. So there's this spiral of alarmism as though war is in sight, that the United States is going to invade them. It's nonsense. They're not going to attack another nuclear power. When has the United States ever sent troops into Russia? 1918. That's it. Russia is obviously at this moment illegally occupying the land of 3 other countries, and indeed has troops in Syria. I acknowledge that's with the Syrians' agreement. Has got its mercenaries, many other countries, despite mercenaries being outlawed in Russia. So really many people think they are actually Russian soldiers, just barely disguised by pretending to be mercenaries in the Central African Republic and many other African countries. So it's about jingoism. It's really this ridiculous brand of it. There's this absurd cult of the personality around Putin as though he's a Superman, and there's a sort of a homoerotic element to him, going around topless. There's obviously an intimate relationship between repression and perversion. It makes me wonder whether he is a repressed homosexual, which is nothing to be ashamed of, but it takes the most contemptible bully to try to spread hatred against gays. So Russia doesn't have independent judges. If it's an important case, the state will always get the result it wants. There seems to be really no limit on an executive power. He might see yet another term limit. The legislature is largely a rubber stamp. They almost always get what they want, and the elections are farcical. There's flagrant vote rigging. Indeed, I met a teacher who told me that she was responsible for putting extra votes in the ballot. Now, how widespread is this? Well, there was a project done about this by an organisation called Golos, as in a vote, the last election, when there was a live CCTV feed in the thousands and thousands of polling stations across the Russian Federation, but they only captured something like a third of them because there was a way of recording it live. And the electoral officials would check that nobody's coming and put lots of votes into the ballot box. So huge numbers of them were fraudulent. They worked out. So it's also something like 2/3 of Putin's votes were fraudulent. So the first round, he won the first round, didn't go to a second round. He might have won just under 50% of the vote. It seems like that. He would have won by the real votes that were cast. This is obviously based on a sample of stations they were able to capture the footage from. They didn't yet manage to capture it from all of them. Seems like he did win, but nothing like as much as he said he won. So it's about cozying up to tyrants and despots and having people toady to him to stroke his ego. It's really about one man's vanity, about militarism, about spending crazy sums of money on the military to fight, chimeras, enemies who don't exist, people who don't actually want to fight you, to start bullying Georgia as though a tiny country is going to pick a fight with them, closing these flights, stopping these flights to Georgia, supposedly for safety. You would do it immediately. You wouldn't phase it in over 2 weeks if it was really a danger. And it was obviously going to hurt Russian people who want to go on holiday. It's going to lose their Russian travel agencies a lot of money, just to try and twist the Georgians' arms, because obviously that's very dangerous for him. This example is set of a free country with a free press and real elections and an independent judiciary and human rights and an economy that's not based on oil and gas, and the public are not ripped off by the kleptocrats. Putin just can't tolerate, he just can't allow that to exist. Freedom, that's a very dangerous example. Ordinary Russians might want the same. So it's about ultranationalism, about expansionism, about irredentism. Here young Russians saying we should take back land because it was in the Russian Empire. A bit like, Russia was part of the Mongolian Empire. Should be Mongolian again? And if not, why not? You're going to get Alaska back. I mean, Western Russia was briefly part of the German Empire. Should it go back to them? I don't think so. So why do we have to turn the clock back all this time? And it's not as though particularly Russia's going to offer that much, like a higher civilization, a better technology. It doesn't really have much to offer like that. I mean, there are aspects of Russian culture I rather appreciate to do with music, the plastic arts, dancing, cuisine and stuff like that. Sincerity in some cases, but not really economically. The political system, no. Almost no inventions in the past century that Russia's come up with. So he's appealing to this supposedly heroic past, despite being obviously a moral and physical coward himself. Not that I'm brave. I don't pretend to be tough. So he's got this bottomless sense of inadequacy. That's why he always needs such a ridiculous and ludicrous level of laudation. So chauvinism is very distasteful. It really is the last refuge of the scoundrel. A scoundrel, as Dr. Johnson said, and this man is a complete mountebank and a rapscallion, a charlatan with his big lies. So using Goebbels' big lies, this theory, as Hitler wrote about them in Mein Kampf, the bigger the lie, the more people will believe it, just telling it shamelessly and repeating it endlessly. And when it becomes absolutely obvious to everyone that it is a lie, just move on. Don't apologize, don't acknowledge it's a lie, just go on to the next lie. Never let people cool down. So vociferous advocacy of the preponderant religion, that's really part of the witch's brew. So really this is from the fascist playbook, as Churchill said, fascism and communism, they're opposite though similar. But liberalism has sometimes gone too far. And then we sort of see liberal censorship in Western countries. It's almost like inverse liberalism, saying we can't cause distress, we can't criticize Islam, for instance. People call that Islamophobic. Now, really, Islamophobia does exist, but there are sensible criticisms of Muslim individuals, of Muslim organizations, of certain Muslim beliefs and practices, which not all Muslims go along with, these beliefs and practices that I would criticize. And it's not racist to do that. So I am for genuine liberalism and people being able to speak their minds frankly. And I'm almost a free speech fundamentalist. Like, take the gay issue. You can't debate homosexual issues in schools, yet lest that be seen to be encouraging it. But in Western countries, you can't debate them either because you're not allowed to say it's bad. Now, I believe you should be allowed to say that it's bad or that it's good. That's real freedom. Teach the debate. And I know some people find that upsetting, but that's the price you pay for living in a free society. It's a price I'm very willing to pay. Criticize me, slag me off. Tell me you can tell me that you think my attitudes are vile or moronic, or that my lifestyle is immoral or something like that. Go ahead. You can say I'm abnormal, unnatural. It doesn't bother me. Of course, you should be allowed to say these things. Even things do upset me. That's no grounds for outlawing it. So I think Putin is a very malign influence in Russia in particular. It's the Russian people who suffer. I'd like them to have liberalism so they just wouldn't be ripped off and exploited by this clique which is terrorizing them for a century in the name of communism, and now is doing it in the name of ultranationalism. And then yet he fulminates against nationalism in other countries. Look how extremely nationalistic he is. There we are. So Putin, he is a very baleful influence in world politics. I wish his influence were diminished. I would like to see sort of an open-minded, reformist person come to office in Russia. Well, perhaps it's a Judas kiss to say this, but I thought Grigory Yavlinsky has the right idea.